Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tressie Camp. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Water Policy. Welcome to our webinar today on this blustery Friday. Today we're here as part of a series that the Center for Water Policy hosts through the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin Water Policy Network. These gatherings are a way for us to bring together network members to discuss research, to form connections among water policy researchers, water law researchers across the universities of Wisconsin. These webinars also highlight various research approaches and methods that we are bringing to questions of water policy. And as a result, we cover many different disciplines, both in the Water Policy Network and in the webinars that we use to highlight researchers. I will hand it over to Anna, who facilitates the Freshwater Collaborative of Wisconsin Water Policy Network.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Thanks, Tressie. Like Tressie mentioned, my name is Anna Watson. I am a water policy specialist here at the Center for Water Policy, and as part of my role, I coordinate the Freshwater Collaborative's Water Policy Network. And I'm excited to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Atapattu. She is currently a teaching professor and director of the Global Legal Studies Center at University of Wisconsin Law School. She's also the executive director of the Human Rights Program at UW-Madison. And she teaches in the areas of international environmental law and climate change and human rights. She's received both a doctorate of philosophy degree and a master of law degree, both from the University of Cambridge. And Dr. Atapattu has worked on several different projects as an independent consultant, attended several climate COP meetings, UN expert consultations, and she's also taught blended learning courses on human rights and the environment. Her research examines the link between human rights and the environment, especially climate change, climate migration, and small island states. And with that, I'll turn it over to our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for inviting me here today. So I'm going to talk about human rights to water and what it means. So this is my outline. So after placing this in context, I'll talk a little bit about climate change and water, and then turn to human right to water, look at the treaties that are relevant, and how the United Nations came to recognize the right to water at the international level. Actually, I forgot to put the time on. Let me do that right now. And then in the third part, I will turn to the United States, what right to water means in the United States, as well as look at some of the advantages of using the rights language in relation to water. So to summarize, as we know, water is essential for human beings for our health and their survival. Unfortunately, though, 2.2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water. That's about 1/3 of the world's population. And again, unfortunately, lack of access to fresh water kills about 5 million people annually, and many of them are under the age of 5 years. The unfortunate thing and the sad part is that these are preventable deaths. Although I mentioned the international human rights treaties, none of them actually specifically embodies human right to water. But the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights recognized, adopted a general comment recognizing a human right to water, which was reinforced by the UN General Assembly in 2010. So, as I said, I will discuss what right to water means. So, what are the obligations of states under international law in relation to right to water? What states have to do to realize this or give effect to this right? And what it means for the US faced with climate change. So as we know, and I may be preaching to the choir, but 70% of the water of the Earth's surface is actually comprises of water. But most of it is not consumable. So that brings a big challenge to us. Um, and as we know, we have different uses of water, from drinking to farming to washing for industries, etc. And in addition, water also has cultural, religious, and spiritual significance for people. So we use water as holy water in relation to certain cultural practices we have. We have, in marriages and stuff like that, also we use water in some cultures. So water also, in addition to its utility, also has cultural and spiritual significance. So that's something that we need to take into account when we deal with different aspects of water usage as well. Um, but unfortunately, how many people do have drinking water? 1 in 4 lack access to safe drinking water. And you see this, you see that there's most water stress in developing parts of the world. And then lack of access to fresh water kills more people than disasters and conflicts put together. And as I said, about over 2.1 billion people lack safe water at home. So that's a lot of people in the world. And if you look at water stress by country, although the United States has one of the biggest freshwater resources in the world in relation to the Great Lakes, we are also facing medium to high water stress. So what does that mean? And then look at Australia, look at some parts of the world that are facing extremely high water stress. Climate change and water, we have seen many pictures like this, right? Increased water stress that's causing desertification, failed crops. And then on the other hand, we also have floods um, uh, associated with severe weather events. So people have said, climate change adaptation is all about water. Either you have too much or too little, right? So that poses another challenge about providing for right to water, for the realization of right to water. In many parts of the world, there is water stress. So looking at climate change and water, as I said, 9 out of 10 climate change events are water related. And the cost of these disasters is also huge. It's probably a little outdated too. It says 80 billion a year, but that's just in middle income and low income countries, right? 12% of the population drinks water from unimproved and unsafe sources. 2 billion people live in countries experiencing high water stress. And 30% of the world's population live without any form of sanitation. That's also a big problem, and that's related to health issues as well, right? So there will be water stress by 2050. Again, Australia is highlighted in many of these charts, but we are also facing water stress. We are currently facing, and it will get exacerbated by 2050. So affected population over 60%. And the main causes are population growth, poor water management, so human causes, as well as climate change. Again, that's human related as well. So turning to international human rights law, these are the main treaties that some of them refer to water, but not really as a human right, but these are human rights instruments. So starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all the way to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. So it's another timeline looking at them. So looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is considered as forming the foundation of modern international human rights law, Article 25 refers to everyone's right to a standard of living adequate for their health and well-being. And it refers to food, clothing, housing, and medical care, but does not really refer to water. Water is not included as one of the conditions that's necessary to realize the right to a standard of living. And this was 1948. Then we come to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which was adopted in 1966 as one of the two conventions giving effect to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it's a declaration, it's not binding as treaties are. So again, Article 11, which sort of reflects Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, talks about the right of everyone for an adequate standard of living. Again, refers to adequate food, clothing, housing, and does not refer to right to water. Then we have CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This was 1979. Now we see a reference to water supply, but not right to water. Then the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was adopted in 1999. Which has near universal ratification, participation, which means almost every country in the world. Unfortunately, the United States remains the only country in the world not to have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Here, in the context of right to health, there is a reference to the provision of clean drinking water. It also refers to the dangers of environmental pollution for the first time. Again, not as a right to water. The Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, 2006, refers to clean water services. So you see a particular trend happening in the later treaties. There is reference to water, but not as a right to water. And the Sustainable Development Goals has a specific goal on providing safe, affordable drinking water, sanitation, and hygiene for everybody by 2030. That's a goal for all the Sustainable Development Goals. Unfortunately, we are not on track to achieve any of these goals by 2030, which is only, well, actually less than 4 years away. So, as I said, the binding treaties do not really refer to water as a human right, although there is a reference to food and housing. Water is not specifically mentioned. So, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights decided to do something about this in 2002. So the committee is the body that's established under the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to oversee the implementation of the convention. It can also receive complaints from individuals about the violation of rights that are included in the covenant. Unfortunately, U.S. has sign this but not ratify. So technically, it's not binding on us. So here, the general comment is like an interpretation of the treaty in question. So it cannot really adopt new rights, but it can interpret existing rights in a way, in an expansive manner. So that's what the committee did in relation to right to water. It said water, human right to water is indispensable to lead a life of dignity. And also said it's a prerequisite for the realization of other rights, like right to life, right to health, etc. Right? And said human right to water entitles everyone to sufficient, safe, acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic users. And the legal hook that it used was the right to an adequate standard of living in Article 11. And the committee said without water, you cannot have an adequate standard of living because it's essential for survival, and said that the word including indicates that the catalog of rights that are mentioned in Article 11 is not exhaustive. So it refers to adequate food, clothing, and housing, but the word including indicates that there are other rights that are necessary for the realization of an adequate standard of living. So there was a legal hook that the committee used to articulate a right to water. And it also expanded on this and said the normative content of right to water includes freedoms as well as entitlements. So freedoms include the right to maintain access to existing water supplies and the right to be free from interference. So the state cannot arbitrarily disconnect your water supply. So, for example, failure to pay your bills may not be a criterion to cut off your water supply. You cannot do that arbitrarily. There is an obligation to investigate contamination of water supplies and provide remedies for that. And the other aspect of this is entitlement. So every person has an equal opportunity to enjoy this right. And this is connected to the non-discrimination principle as well. The components of right to water includes quality, accessibility, excuse me, and affordability. And the committee expanded on the accessibility aspect, saying that there should be physical accessibility. Clearly, there should be water physically. Economic accessibility, the water right to water should be economically accessible. And information accessibility is also important, and we see this playing out time and time again in relation to many of the human rights violations that take place. Either there's not enough information given to the public about a particular situation. We saw this in relation to Flint, Michigan, for example. Or the state might actually intentionally suppress information relating to a particular situation. Again, in Flint, Michigan, we saw this. The state was not really providing correct information or withheld information in relation to the situation. And then the fourth principle is non-discrimination. The water, and this applies in relation to all human rights, should be afforded on a non-discriminatory basis. You cannot discriminate, right to water on grounds of race, color, sex, or age, where you come from or your political opinion. So these are not confined to right to water. This is a general principle applicable under international human rights law. But we know that in practice, the situation is very different, right? Minorities, low-income communities are disproportionately affected by environmental problems, by lack of water, etc. So going back to groups needing special protection, the gender comment also referred to these groups that are historically marginalized or have physical inaccessibility that need special protection when it comes to right to water. So women, as we know, as caregivers, have to provide water for their families. And in many societies, where they don't have physical accessibility to water, they have to walk miles to collect water for their families. And with climate change, this situation is going to get exacerbated. They'll have to walk longer. As a result, they are vulnerable to sexual harassment and physical violence as a result. Water scarcity will affect them. Um, so women, and as we know, in many societies, they don't enjoy equal rights as men. And because they have to spend longer time collecting water, they have less time for educational purposes and recreation and things like that. So this marginalization and vulnerability it will get exacerbated. Indigenous peoples, again, we have seen that they are disproportionately affected by environmental issues as well as lack of water. Um, People with disabilities, physically, they are unable to access water in some instances, so special protection must be provided for them, special accessibility issues, price, and the children. Again, in many societies, children, along with their mothers mostly, go to collect water. So as a result, they lose schooling and things like that. And also, physically, it's not good for them to sort of collect water, carry them back to their homes. And also, they are more vulnerable to waterborne diseases. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning that about 1 million people die each year due to contaminated water or water-related diseases. And unfortunately, children are at the risk. Many of them are children. And then we have refugees and IDPs, internally displaced people. Again, they don't have access to proper water sources. Sanitation is a problem. And older people, again, mobility is an issue. So older people also need special protection as well as those who are detained. They lack access to water services as well. And during COVID, we saw these vulnerabilities multiply because, health personnel kept on telling us you have to wash hands frequently, etc. But if you don't have access to water, ready access to water, these pandemics can have a disproportionate impact on these groups as well. So, looking at the obligations of states, again, this is not confined to right to water. These positive and negative obligations states have, they apply across the board to all human rights. So the duty to respect means that states should not interfere with the enjoyment of rights. So it's kind of a negative right. You should not, basically interfere with the enjoyment of rights. And then states must protect you from third parties who might infringe your rights or block access to your rights. So this is particularly important in the context of right to water because, as we know, in many societies, including ours, provision of water is done by private companies. So what are the obligations of states in relation to these third parties? Because international human rights law typically does not extend to private actors. The state is the main guardian of your rights, but the state has a duty to ensure that these third parties um, do not infringe your rights. And then the duty to fulfill means states must take positive measures to facilitate the enjoyment of the right by adopting legislation, by establishing institutions, monitoring activities, ensuring that water is not contaminated, providing information to people, etc. So this respect, protect, and fulfill typology is important in relation to right to water as well. So we talked about the non-discrimination principle, and then in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution on right to water. So the general committees the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, then the comment on right to water is not binding. The General Assembly resolution is also not binding, but this is the plenary body of the UN that's adopting a resolution. So it carries more weight than the general comment on right to water. So this recognized that the right to safe, clean drinking water and sanitation is a human right. And it called upon states and international organizations to provide financial resources, build capacity, transfer technology, so that states can provide safe, clean, accessible, and affordable drinking water and sanitation for everybody. It's interesting to note who voted for this resolution. As you can see, we did not vote, as well as Canada and Australia did not vote for the adoption of this right. And the United States actually has consistently opposed recognizing water as a human right. Then the UN Human Rights Council also adopted a resolution confirming that everybody has a human right to safe drinking water and sanitation without discrimination, and again referred to sufficient safe, accessible, and acceptable water for personal and domestic use. And the Human Rights Council also created a mandate for a special rapporteur on right to water. And the reports of the special rapporteur are also important to look at the content of this right. The special rapporteur also does country visits to look at the situation in a given country. So those reports, country reports, are also useful to see what the situation is like, what the recommendations that the body has made in relation to right to water. Another thing the Human Rights Council resolution did was to connect this with other human rights, just like the UN General Assembly resolution did, saying that these rights are useful and necessary for the enjoyment of other rights. So if you look at world water use, the US has the biggest water footprint in the world per capita. So, but we are also facing water scarcity, especially in the West. The eastern side is pretty okay, but the western side, as we know, California had a drought for a long time. even Colorado and places like that are facing water scarcity. And in addition, we have also seen severe weather events taking place as a result of climate change. And in 2030, US had over $1 billion climate-related disasters every 2 weeks on average. And so the economic impact of these disasters, climate-related disasters, although some argue that climate change is not happening, it's a hoax, and all the rest of it, and we have reversed safeguards relating to climate change. The reality, of course, is that we are already facing these, environmental as well as economic impacts of climate change. So, turning to the US, we are under the impression, we assume that everybody in the US, as the richest country in the world, has access to safe and affordable water and sanitation services in the US. But the reality is not so, right? Many low-income communities, communities of color, indigenous communities lack access to water for most basic human needs and sanitation, especially the communities that are awaiting relocation due to climate change in Alaska, for example, don't have running water. And because they are to be relocated anyway, nobody is spending money or resources to improve their living conditions. So this is a real problem, right? So there are regional disparities in relation to climate availability, climatic variations, climate change, as well as management strategies and policies, and worsening water quality have also affected access to water in the US. And as we know, the US Bill of Rights does not include socioeconomic rights except a reference to right to property. And this is, of course, not very surprising because most of the older constitutions do not have economic, social, and cultural rights included in their Bill of Rights. So if you look at the water usage in the US, as I said, we have the biggest water footprint per capita as well as the biggest carbon footprint. Domestic and residential purposes, obviously, we need water for our day-to-day, users, cooking, washing, all that. Then we need it for agriculture, and also for industry and energy production. And one of the biggest debates that are going on right now is about these data centers. In Wisconsin, we have seen these communities are opposing the establishment of data centers due to the high energy use, but water usage is also a factor because they need a lot of water to cool these data centers because of the high usage of energy. So that's another sort of emerging issue that communities are facing. And the demand for water has tripled in the last 30 years. And a study has found out that 70% of counties in the US will be facing moderate to extreme risk of demand outstripping the supply by 2050. So we will have much more demand for water than we are able to supply, and this will be the issue for 70% of the counties in the US. So, looking at environmental justice issues, affordability is a big problem in the US. During 1990 to 2006, cost of water has increased by 106%. And there's a disproportionate impact on minorities with regard to these rates of increase, as well as pollution is higher in racial minority communities. Quality of water is also a problem. We saw this in relation to Flint, Michigan. And access accessibility is a problem. And as we know, the environmental justice movement started because of the disproportionate impact on low income and minority communities. Excuse me. The disproportionate impact on not just water, but environmental pollution and hazardous activities. And we see this playing out in relation to access to water as well. A good example, unfortunately, is Flint, Michigan, the water crisis that took place because of some of the decisions that were taken by the authorities. Water became contaminated with high levels of lead. People died as a result, people got sick as a result. So again, I referred to information accessibility earlier. This was a classic case where that was not afforded to people either. This is a timeline. I'm not going to go through that, but I wanted to highlight the demography of Flint, Michigan. Over 50% of the people are minorities. 27% are children under the age of 18, and 37% are below the poverty level. So it's a classic environmental justice issue that took place in relation to access to water. What are the other challenges? So we know that we have had systemic barriers to participation by disadvantaged communities due to some of the racial policies that we have had. As a result, they have been excluded from environmental decision making. They are underrepresented in government, law, and businesses. There's chronic lack of transparency and adequate access to information. And on top of that, agricultural and industrial operations are often not held accountable for their impact on local water sources. And we know that the cost of pollution from these industrial discharges are disproportionately borne by vulnerable communities. For example, indigenous populations in New Mexico, for example, are affected by unremediated uranium mining waste there. Sorry about the typo there. And more mining operations are authorized without actually cleaning up the impact of previous uranium mining operations. So looking quickly at human right to water in the US, as I said, US has consistently opposed the adoption of right to water at the international level. We did not vote for the Human Rights Council resolution or the General Assembly resolution. We opposed the adoption of General Comment 15. At the state level, only a handful of states recognize a human right to water. So California, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania are the only states that specifically refer to right to water. The California Water Code says every human being has a right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water. But we have several states that have adopted green amendments to their constitutions, recognizing a right to a healthful environment. So Montana, Pennsylvania, Hawaii, Illinois, New York is the latest state. And about 20 more states are considering adopting these green amendments to their constitutions. And we have seen a way of litigation by youth suing their states with our children's trust, suing their state and the Trump administration in relation to climate change. So one of the arguments that I would like to advance is, can we use this right to a healthful environment, which includes right to water, to press states to recognize, at least implicitly, a right to water. And the International Court of Justice endorsed in their advisory opinion recently on climate change a right to a healthy environment. So that's another hook that we can use at the state level, because I don't think right now we can do much at the federal level, but state and local level, I think we can pressure states and local authorities to recognize this right, especially those states that have included a right to a healthy environment at the state level. So recognizing what are the advantages quickly. Legally, we can press states politically, and humanitarian benefits are also there if we have a right to water. Human rights language is morally powerful. It's a useful tool in the hands of civil society. And as we saw from the elaboration of right to water by the Human Rights Council, there are specific obligations that states have to provide, to realize the right to water. And then states must also take special measures to protect disadvantaged communities. So to conclude, as I said, about 60% of the world's population will face water scarcity because of climate change, including in the US. And some have predicted that the next wave of conflicts will be over water. We have seen conflicts over oil taking place, but the next wave of conflicts could be over water because of the pressure that climate change poses to water. As I said, language of rights is morally compelling and it gives a human face to the problem. And it also imposes clear obligations of states to protect communities, especially those groups that are disadvantaged or need special protection. So, with 52 seconds to spare, I will stop there. Thank you so much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much for a great presentation, Professor. That was really interesting, and I am definitely happy to throw out some questions to start, but I'd like to give the audience the chance to ask any questions first. Feel free to just jump in. Okay, I will ask a question then. I'm curious, Professor, I have one kind of non-legal or policy question specifically. It's interesting to me that food and clothing and shelter were explicitly in some of these international human rights documents so much earlier than the explicit right to clean drinking water. And I am curious why, if you could pinpoint any reason or, number of reasons that that's the case. My second kind of more targeted policy question is for the states that have adopted a state level human right to water. Have you seen any legal or policy tools being exercised in those states that this group should keep in mind?
Mhm. Thank you so much for those questions. With regard to the first one, I'm not entirely sure why the older treaties do not specifically refer to water. It could be because, the population pressures were not that severe on water at the beginning. But later treaties, as we saw, recognize this impact on water. So they are referring to water, the need to have water, the provision of clean drinking water. So I think it could be a reflection of the times that, the earlier treaties did not refer to environment either. I mean, we still don't have a right to a healthy environment included in any of the treaties, human rights treaties. The General Assembly recognized that only 3 years ago. So although a lot had been happening at the regional level as well as the state level, nothing the international treaties, there were political reasons to the right to a healthy environment not to be recognized, even by journalist resolution. One of the opponents was the US, but ultimately, when the resolution was adopted, we actually voted for it, which was a surprise to a lot of people. So I think at the beginning, it may not have been felt as so pressing. And then one of the objections that the US posed for the adoption of a right to water is that because we have so much fresh water in the Great Lakes, we thought that we will be physically required to provide water to other countries. So we said this cannot be a human right. And they also opposed it, saying that the committee had no authority to articulate a new right. So that's why they use the existing sort of language to articulate a right to a healthy environment. For your second question, unfortunately, I don't know the answer. There may have been cases looking at water specifically, but I don't work at the national level in the US. My work is mainly international, so I cannot answer your question specifically, but I know about some of the climate change cases that have been brought by youth looking at the right to a healthy environment to sue their states to do more on climate change. So that's why I feel that, although only 3 states have recognized the right to water, we can use this more broader sort of framework to bring in water as well. In litigation at the state level.
Thanks for those thoughtful answers. I'll just do another check of the audience to see if there are any questions. Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. I have so many questions, but I'll narrow it down to we'll start with just the methods question, because in the other webinars, what we've been trying to feature is a little bit of articulating what your research methods are. And I think you could probably just spend a minute talking about how you approach your research on human rights.
Sure. My methods, I mean, I don't actually do empirical research as such. My work is mainly international, as I said. So literature surveys and looking at treaties and, mainly looking at what the UN has done and the statements that states make at the international level. I'm also very interested in looking at jurisprudence. Especially in South Asia, where states have, the courts have articulated environmental rights in a much broader manner than we see in the US, for example. We haven't really articulated environmental rights in our jurisprudence, unfortunately. So looking at, jurisprudence, how courts have developed these rights, I would ideally like to do more empirical grounded research in countries, but I have not, unfortunately, been able to do that.
So does that
But
also,
if I can add to that, one of the books I did recently was to see how the UN human rights institutions have articulated environmental issues, because, as I said, the human rights bodies don't really have a mandate on environmental issues. But increasingly, because of the close link with human rights, many of them are, pronouncing on climate change, pronouncing on states' obligations in relation to environmental pollution, sustainable development. So I wanted to see how whether there was any coherence, whether there was any inconsistency when it came to these human rights bodies. So I looked at their mandates, the country reports that they have come up with. I looked at the gender comments that they have articulated, as well as some of the cases that have come before them. Because some of these committees can actually receive complaints from individuals. So, and it was really interesting to see how these different bodies actually look at each other. They look at the regional treaties as well as regional human rights courts in their pronouncements. So I actually was quite surprised to see a lot of coherence when it came to these human rights bodies. And the book is open access if anybody is interested in reading it. So that was one of the more empirical studies that I did. And nobody had looked at these human rights bodies across the board. Some of them had looked at individual bodies, but not across the board. So that was one of the empirical works I did. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really good to hear that um, all that stuff had been in the background and for you to put that out there for us to see how you do your work.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? I'll just do a toggle through the screen to see if anyone's raising their hand. I don't see any.
I have a, oh, go ahead,
Go ahead.
Hadi.
Oh, God, no, no, it's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I was just gonna ask you, obviously the US kind of isn't a good example of, adopting implementation measures or even something, in our Constitution to protect this right to water. But are there any other countries specifically that you've been able to see either good implementation to protect this right, either like through the Constitution or through things like legislation, etc.?
Um, Yeah, I think European countries have been able to, implement this. But one of the interesting things about Europe is that they also have a regional human rights system, regional human rights body. Um, we have two, but we have not really signed on to the convention, American Convention of Human Rights. The European Court of Human Rights um, has been able to sort of develop environmental rights, and the decisions of um, the European Court are binding on the members, and the members have incorporated the convention into their domestic law. Um, so at the European level, things are different, but the interesting thing is that the European Convention of Human Rights does not refer to environmental issues or right to water, but through their right to private life, right to privacy and family life, they have been able to bring in environmental rights and right to water as well. I have not specifically looked at right to water in Europe. I have looked more at right to a healthy environment more broadly. And as I mentioned, South Asia has been really has developed a huge body of jurisprudence on environmental rights by um, interpreting existing rights to include, so existing rights meaning right to life or right to equality, to articulate right to healthy environment, including right to water. The problem there is, although there is, due to public interest litigation, there is this very rich body of jurisprudence. Implementation at the ground level is a big problem. So there's a big mismatch between the jurisprudence and the actual situation on the ground. So one of the biggest issues is population growth, corruption, lack of proper institutions, lack of monitoring, and of course lack of resources as well. So it's a big issue in developing countries, and then climate change is going to exacerbate the situation, unfortunately. Yeah.
Hadi, we have a minute or two left. Did you still have a question?
Thank you for a good presentation. Thank you all for organizing this webinar. My question is, you talk about the water right. Okay, and also you mentioned part of your presentation about the data center right now. Okay, we know they need a lot of water and also lots of place they want to build it. There is a water stress there. And actually today I just saw one paper in Nature that talk about the water stress agenda for future. That's something we should consider. Okay. What should we handle this kind of water right for community in any agreement? Do you have any idea about that? Appreciate it to share.
Yeah, I think at least in the developed world, I mean, the situation in developing world is very different, right? I mean, many of them don't have access to sanitation that's posing a real threat to health issues. One of the things we can look at in the developed world, because we have such a large footprint, is reducing our consumption and wastage. We waste a lot of water too. In one of the slides, I didn't actually include it in my slides, but one of the things that I saw was that we waste about 15% of water, right? So the disparity that we see, even in the United States, although we have so much water in some parts, in some parts of the country, we have to put like hose bands and things like that too because of drought. So how do we sort of deal with that disparity? And some might argue that, right, looking at it from a human rights point of view might not solve the problem. We need to have political will to address. And I think unless we take climate change seriously, I don't think we can look at water separately because these are all connected. So I think climate change is going to be the biggest challenge that the world will have. And, salinity, that's something that I did not mention. Salinity of water is also going to be a problem because of sea level rise and things like that too. So I think we really need to press policymakers, at least at the state level, to take climate change seriously.
Thank you. Again, thank you Professor for your presentation and everyone in the audience for your good questions. We will make this webinar available online via our YouTube channel. Thanks, Anna, for your facilitation of the talk today and through this academic year. This webinar does close out our Case Studies and Methods webinar series for academic year 25 to 26, which is hard to believe. But please keep an eye out for an email for opportunities to be involved in webinars next academic year, and for any additional updates. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks all. Bye.